Thank you, Mr. President. The amendment that I offer is co-sponsored by Senators McCain, McConnell, Bond, Coburn, Isaacson, and Roberts, and it is an alternative to the legislation that is under consideration by the Senate today. And that is the tax extenders bill that was the subject of some debate last week that will continue through this week, perhaps into next week. I'm not sure exactly when it will conclude. But what my amendment does is presents an alternative, because the amendment that is under consideration that has been offered up by the Democrat majority here in the Senate adds almost $80 billion to the federal debt. It raises taxes by $70 billion and increases spending by $126 billion. Now, to put that in the proper context, it's important to remember that we have a current $13 trillion debt. The amount of publicly held debt is $8.6 trillion, but if you include the amount of debt that is owed between government agencies, intergovernmental debt, it is $13 trillion that our government owes and is in debt. And what has been proposed by the other side is in direct contradiction of some legislation that we passed here a few months ago that suggested that everything that we were going to do around here, or almost everything, was going to be paid for. It's called PAYGO. We passed PAYGO rules. It was highly touted at the time, great fanfare associated with the passage of PAYGO rules that would insist that when there is new spending or tax cuts, that those be offset by some spending cuts or some combination of tax increases that would make sure that there was no net impact on the deficit. But what is happening here is the exact opposite of that, because what we're seeing happen with the legislation that is before the Senate today is the PAYGO rules, if in fact this bill were enacted and becomes law, ends up being about $200 billion now in new debt that we have added to the public debt since PAYGO has been enacted.
Could I ask my friend to yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
I would just say, you'll get the floor right back. I told the Republican leader earlier today I was going to file cloture, so I'm going to do that now, recognizing that this isn't going to in any way hinder people offering amendments. But I've told the Republican leader I'm going to do that, and frankly I want to do it now so I don't have to worry about it later. Mr. President, I have a cloture petition at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Do you want to sign it or not?
We have enough on it.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the standing rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close.
Mr. President, I would ask further reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
And I express my appreciation to my friend from South Dakota and ask that his statement not appear interrupted in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, and I appreciate the senator from Nevada, the majority leader, yielding back time so I can continue to speak about this amendment. And I understand that the process for consideration of this legislation will now be somewhat truncated if in fact cloture is invoked. I suspect it won't be long now we'll be having a vote on that, but I would hope that my colleagues would defeat the motion to invoke cloture until such time as we've had an opportunity to debate many of these important amendments. And clearly I believe that the amendment that I'm discussing right now is one that we need to vote on. I suspect there will be others of my colleagues who will want to offer amendments that I hope would be able to be debated and voted upon before this legislation moves forward. But the point I want to make again, Mr. President, is this. Since the enactment of the PAYGO rules, the pay-as-you-go rules here in the Senate, about $200 billion, if the current legislation on the floor today is enacted, will have been added to the federal debt. That is $200 billion which we hand to our children and grandchildren to pay for, notwithstanding what we have just said publicly here in the United States Senate a few months ago, that all these things are going to be paid for, and that we're now going to be serious here in the United States Senate and in the Congress about making sure that we are not piling more and more debt on future generations. That is completely contradicted by the legislation that we will be voting on here in the near future on this tax extenders bill, because it does increase the debt by almost $80 billion. As I said earlier, it raises taxes by almost $70 billion. So what I offer is an alternative to that approach. And what this alternative does is, rather than increasing and raising taxes, it reduces taxes by $26 billion. It cuts spending by $100 billion. And it reduces the debt by $55 billion. So instead of more spending, more taxes, and more debt in the middle of an economy that's trying to get back on its feet and create jobs, my alternative, Mr. President, the one that I will offer on behalf of my colleagues who, as I mentioned earlier, are co-sponsors of this amendment, will in fact reduce spending, reduce taxes, and reduce debt. Now, I think that's a good deal for the American taxpayer, and I think it strikes at the very heart of what we ought to be focused on here, which is job creation. We hear the other side talk a lot about job creation, but when it comes time to create jobs, you can't find many policies coming out of Washington, D.C. today that actually are additive when it comes to job creation. In fact, it is, as I said earlier, just the opposite. You've got a massive new health care entitlement that, when it's fully implemented, will cost $2.5 trillion over 10 years. In my view, is going to add enormously to the federal debt because of all the double counting that was used to understate the true cost of that legislation. You had a $1 trillion stimulus bill passed a year ago, which was totally debt, was totally put on the debt for America's future generations. You've got now discussion of a new energy tax in the form of some cap-and-trade legislation that could come before the Senate in the next few months. And you just go down the list. At every turn, what this Congress has done in the last several months, in the last year and a half since the new administration came to office, is to increase taxes, to increase spending, and to increase debt, and to increase the size and the scope of government. We continue to see this effort to expand government. And when we expand government, obviously it takes more revenues to fund that government, create new bureaucracies, which is what we'll see with regard to the health care legislation. And in the end, takes more and more of those dollars out of the private economy where the real permanent job creation should be occurring. Instead, what we should be focused on, Mr. President, is creating incentives for small businesses to create jobs. Rather than creating more government, expanding the size of government here in Washington, D.C., we ought to be looking at what we can do to provide incentives for the economic engine in our economy, and that's our small businesses, to go out there and do what they do best, and that is create jobs. But what you hear repeatedly from small businesses, not only in my state of South Dakota, but all across the country, is there is so much policy uncertainty coming out of Washington, and there is so much concern about the spending and the debt and the taxes that a lot of the small businesses who might be making investments that would create jobs or hire new personnel, hire new people, buy a new piece of equipment, make capital investment, they are sitting on that investment for fear that the next policy to come out of Washington, D.C. could be a new energy tax, could be higher taxes. And we all know that starting next year, you're going to see higher taxes on dividends, higher taxes on capital gains, higher taxes on marginal income, unless Congress takes steps to extend some of these expiring tax provisions. That being said, what we're doing here today is going to make matters that much worse. If you're a small business person in this country, if you are someone who is in this economy and is concerned about federal debt, is concerned about federal spending, is concerned about taxes, then the legislation that is before the Senate right now, if adopted, is going to add, as I said earlier, another almost $80 billion to the federal debt, will raise taxes by $70 billion, and increase spending by $126 billion. Mr. President, there is a better way, and that's why I offer up this amendment. Now, this amendment does a number of things. It reduces spending in a number of areas. It deals with some of the provisions of expiring tax law that everybody here agrees need to be fixed. There are things that both sides agree on. Both Democrats and Republicans here in the Senate believe that it's important that we extend unemployment insurance for those people who have lost jobs in the economy. Both Republicans and Democrats think it's important that there are certain expiring tax provisions that need to be extended. The research and development tax credit, for example, is one thing that comes to mind. But there are a whole list of these expiring tax provisions that need to be extended that both sides agree should be done. The difference in how we go about doing that is, I think, what is going to be the difference in the amendment that I would offer versus the underlying legislation. And that is, again, what I would do is reduce federal spending and address the expiring tax law, the need to extend unemployment insurance in a way that doesn't raise taxes, add to the debt, and increase dramatically federal spending in this country. So, what does the amendment essentially do? Very briefly, it includes all the major priorities that both parties want to accomplish, but it drops the spending that's been rejected by the Senate. It would eliminate the $24 billion that is in the Senate bill that was not in the House bill that deals with the bailout for states around the country. It does offer, by the way, an additional year of the so-called doc fix. Now, there's been a lot of discussion here about extending the doc fix into the future. And the underlying bill that the Democrat majority has put forward does extend the doc fix. The reimbursement that physicians receive under Medicare would drop dramatically if nothing is done by Congress to address that, and both sides agree that that needs to be addressed. Frankly, it should have been done during the health care debate, but it wasn't. And so the underlying bill, the majority Democrat bill here before the Senate, would extend the doc fix through the end of 2011. What my alternative amendment would do was will extend the doc fix through the end of the year 2012. So you get an additional year for the doc fix if that's something that physicians around this country are interested in. And I know for a fact that it is, because my physicians in South Dakota, like I'm sure most of my colleagues, hear on a regular basis from their physicians around the country. It drops all the tax increases in the bill, including carried interest, the tax on professional service S-corps, the international provisions, and the increase in the per barrel tax that funds the oil spill liability trust fund that will raise gas prices for consumers around the country. The alternative amendment that I filed is fully paid for with spending cuts. It offers more than $100 billion in savings by actually doing what the American people want, and that is reducing spending. I mean, every American is dealing with a tough economy. A lot of Americans have lost jobs. A lot of Americans certainly have lost income. A lot of Americans have seen their net worth plummet as a result of the economic circumstances in which the country finds itself. And so they're all making hard decisions. They're sitting around the kitchen table. They are having these discussions with their family about what part of their budget to cut or what they're going to have to do without. The only place where that hasn't been true is here in Washington, D.C. Why shouldn't we, as the leaders of this country, be willing to make the hard decisions that every American family is having to make? Well, this legislation does that. It takes $37.5 billion of the $50 billion in unobligated stimulus funds and uses those to extend existing tax and benefit provisions. It cuts money from the government by reducing congressional budgets right here, close to home. We ought to have to do what every American family, what every American business is having to do right now, and that's make some hard decisions and reduce our own spending. So it does reduce congressional budgets. It rescinds unspent federal funds, those funds that have been appropriated but not spent. It requires the government to sell unused land and auction off unused equipment. So it generates some additional revenue that way. It imposes a one-year freeze on the salaries of federal employees and eliminates their bonuses, and it caps the total number of federal employees at current levels. In other words, the federal government can't continue to grow and expand at a time when we see a lot of our businesses around this country having to lay workers off or cut back their hours. And it collects $3 billion in unpaid taxes from federal employees. It encourages responsibility and prioritizing by requiring a 5% across-the-board discretionary spending cut for all agencies except at the VA and the Department of Defense. So 5% across the board for all agencies except VA and DOD. And we think, again, that's an important step to take if we're serious about getting our own spending under control and addressing what is a very serious problem for the future of this country, and that's the ballooning federal debt, the continual growth of government and spending and taxes. It saves $5 billion by eliminating non-essential government travel, and it eliminates bonuses for poor-performing government contractors. And finally, Mr. President, it adds a new deficit reduction trust fund where rescinded balances and money saved through this amendment will be deposited for the purposes of paying down the federal debt. Now, I think this amendment, Mr. President, ought to be a no-brainer for all of our colleagues here in the Senate because it reduces the deficit by over $50 billion. It cuts spending by over $100 billion. It extends the existing tax law, the provisions that we've all talked about that both sides think are important, and it provides 6 more months of stimulus unemployment benefits for those who have lost jobs in our economy. Now, as I said earlier, Mr. President, that is the exact opposite of the approach taken by the Democrat majority, which is, as I said before, the way that they finance all these things is through $80 or $70 billion in new taxes. Again, many of those taxes are going to hit squarely on our small businesses that are the economic engine, the job creators in our economy, and are going to hopefully lead us out of this economic malaise that we're in and get us on to times where we're growing and expanding and creating more and more jobs. And it adds $80 billion to the federal debt, which, as I mentioned earlier, is at $13 trillion. If you include all the federal debt, that amount held by the public, held by foreign countries, held by people here in this country, and then you add in the intergovernmental debt that's owed to various agencies of government, we're at $13 trillion and counting. And in fact, if you look at the trajectory going into the future, we're talking about doubling and tripling that debt, doubling it in 5 years, tripling it in 10, and we're going to get to the point where over 4% of our entire economy is spent just paying interest on the debt. I mean, think about that. Over 4% of our entire economy, we have a $14 trillion economy, would be spent just paying for interest on our federal debt. Now, there's going to come a point 10 years out from now when the amount of money that we have to spend to finance our debt, to pay for the interest on the debt, exceeds the amount that we spend on our military. Think about that. We would spend more financing the debt that we owe, spend more on interest payments on the debt that we owe than we actually spend on our national security. That is a staggering, staggering thought if you think about it, and that's what we have to try and avoid. And the only way we do that is by getting serious and starting here and starting now. Now, my colleagues on the Democrat majority side have said, because they passed PAYGO, that now we are on a different path. It's a different set of rules. There's a new sheriff in town. We're going to deal with these issues differently. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is the same pattern, the same old way of doing things, which is declare everything an emergency, borrow the money from China, and hand the bill to our children and grandchildren. It's time that that stopped. And this amendment gives us an opportunity to do that. And I think to put things into perspective, because I think sometimes these numbers get to be very abstract, and you listen to politicians get up and talk about debt and spending and deficits and that sort of thing, and it's hard to kind of comprehend, if you will, the dimensions that we're talking about. I mean, $13 trillion. It's hard to even contemplate what $1 trillion is. And so, just to put that into proper perspective, if you were to equate a dollar to a second, how much is a trillion seconds? I asked this question of a bunch of, I spoke at Boise State a week ago, or a little over a week ago now, and I asked the Boise Staters to sit down and do the arithmetic and to figure out how much a trillion seconds is, because I think it helps put into perspective how much $1 trillion is. $1 trillion is more money than I think anybody can ever it's hard even to wrap your mind around what $1 trillion represents. But if you equate that to 1 trillion seconds, 1 trillion seconds is 31,746 years. 31,746 years. That's what 1 trillion seconds represents. Well, we're now $1 trillion in debt. We are $13 trillion in debt. How much is 13 trillion seconds? Over 412,000 years. Over 412,000 years. I mean, that's if to help people understand and to put it into a certain perspective, that's the amount of money, that's the $13 trillion that we now owe. That's today. And as I said before, if you look at the publicly held portion of that, we're expected to double that in 5, triple it in 10 years. It took us 200 years of American history to get to $1 trillion, and we have exploded that. And if you look at the trend lines and where we're headed as a nation, Mr. President, it is a very, very scary thought. It should be scary to all Americans, and I know it is, and it certainly should be scary to the members of this chamber. And that's why every time we deal with a major piece of legislation, foremost in our mind ought to be, how is this going to impact the fiscal balance sheet of this country? How is this going to make the next generation, how is it going to improve their standard of living, their quality of life? What is it going to do to them? And are we going to be the first generation to bequeath to the next generation a lower standard of living and a lower quality of life because we haven't been willing to make the hard choices and to make the hard decisions that are so essential if we're going to get our country on a fiscal path? And so, Mr. President, I hope that this amendment, which I said I think is very common sense, it does address the issues that both sides agree on. It addresses the issue of extending expiring tax provisions that many people on both sides care about. It extends unemployment insurance, till the end of the year, and it does extend the doc fix beyond what the base bill does. The base bill extends it to through the end of the year 2011. What this amendment would do would be to extend it to the end of the year 2012. So we have an opportunity for United States senators to make a vote and to let everybody know, let their constituents know whether or not they are serious about getting spending under control, about making sure that we're doing everything we can to create the right economic conditions for job creation. And by that, I mean keeping taxes low on small businesses, not raising taxes by $70 billion, which is what this bill does, and whether or not we are serious here in Washington, D.C., about listening to the American people and what they are saying with regard to spending. They want us to cut federal spending. They want us to do what they're having to do in their family budgets and in their small business budgets. What every American is now having to deal with is becoming more fiscally responsible, dealing with austerity measures that will keep them from having to go deeply into hawk or into bankruptcy. We're doing that here. We're going into bankruptcy. We just have the luxury here in Washington, D.C. of being able to continue to borrow and borrow and borrow and put it on the credit card and hand the bill to our children and grandchildren. It is time, Mr. President, for that to stop. It can stop with this amendment. And so I would, with that, Mr. President, I will yield the floor and hope that as we continue debate on the underlying bill and get votes on these amendments, that my colleagues here in the United States Senate will do the right thing for the future of this country and start to get spending under control and start to pay for the various things that we continue to borrow for so that we're not piling more and more debt on future generations. Mr. President, I yield the floor.